when they do. Welcome everyone to this session of the Mexican Studies Seminar from the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Emilio Curí, I'm the director of the center, and today we are very pleased to welcome Professor Miles Rodriguez, who is Assistant Professor of Historical Studies at Bard College. He holds a PhD in history from Harvard University and has recently published a very interesting book, which is the subject of today's presentation. The book and the talk today are entitled Movements After Revolution, A History of People's Struggles in Mexico. As usual, in case you haven't been here before, we'll have a presentation for the first half an hour or so, and then we'll follow with a session of questions, comments, etc. So with that, join me in welcoming Miles Rodriguez to the Mexican Studies Seminar. Welcome, Miles.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Please allow me to thank the Katz Center for Mexican Studies, its director, Emilio Curí, and Alberto Ortega for inviting me to join the seminar for the spring quarter of 2022. My own research owes much to the influence and work of the late Frida Katz and of Emilio Curí. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and thanks to all of you in attendance. First thing I'd like to say is that this talk, as Emilio mentioned, is about my recently published book, the title of the presentation. What I'd like to do right now, really quickly, is place a link to the book in the chat. So if you click on the chat, actually, let me go ahead and share screen to do this with you. Should take you to this page. And if you go to where the icon is, where it says open access, you can immediately download a PDF copy of it for free. So go ahead and I would encourage you to go ahead and just click the link, go to the open access, unlock lock, click PDF, and beautiful, there it is. You can just immediately get it as an open access document and download it, at your leisure. If you'd like to follow along or take a look at it while I'm talking, it's all there. So yeah, oh, you're very welcome. So yeah, let me go ahead and go off screen now that I've shown you that. Okay. Anyway, the book was published digitally in March and will be published as a physical hardback copy in June. I'm happy to say more later about how this became an open access book and why I support fully accessible sources like this. I think it's really great to be able to have sources of any kind that you can just immediately access and share in that way without having to go through any other trouble. The name of this book contains much information about the story and arguments within it. Today I would like to focus on the name, story, the arguments, and what I tried to do with the book. I hope to explain why I wrote the book without giving away all of the details, and hope that you'll be inspired to read and dialogue with it after this talk. The name Movements After Revolution indicates that this book is about movements in plural. So more than one movement in motion and historical change after the end of the Mexican Revolution. Since I take the revolution to have only been in the 1910s, I mean the first post-revolutionary decade to have been the 1920s to the Great Depression. So this was one of my goals, to see if it was possible and how to write about more than one movement in their connections and disconnections, in alliances, if not also their antagonisms with each other and other forces in the early post-revolutionary era. The movements I studied were specifically the labor movement and the agrarian movement at the national level. More specifically, it was about certain independent parts of both movements compared to the more well-known state-allied or official parts. Saying it that way, I immediately mean to portray that both movements were very divided and that it is wrong to consider them to have been united or to refer generically to either movement as if only one organization represented them. In fact, there were many different organizations within each movement, an incredible variety of them. They took on a breathtaking array of different forms, different goals, local, national, and international connections, ideologies, relations with each other, and relations with companies, landlords, and the state. This variety and complexity excited me early on and motivated me to figure them out. One challenge was simply trying to keep track of all these moving parts and their names, which were numerous and often confusing, especially in abundant acronyms. I noticed that the scholarship early on noticed this variety, but for some good reasons, most studies only focused on the well-known official organizations in both movements, and that the names of those organizations became a kind of shorthand for the movements as a whole, which I thought tended to elide other groups. I wanted to study those other groups, which I thought were in some ways as powerful, if not more so, than the better known organizations that received much more scholarly attention. Those included unions and strategic national industries like railroads, mining, and oil, and that later formed into Mexico's first nationwide industry-wide unions, and gave rise to national industrial unionism in Mexico. Those also included agrarian leagues in most states, best known in Veracruz, but that formed into a national force as well. These more independent organizations tended to have, or seem to have, more revolutionary dimensions than the seemingly more moderate state-allied organizations that grew after the Mexican Revolution. And many of these other organizations that I look at were organized and or led by members of Mexico's first Communist Party. They all had interesting global connections with international revolutionary institutions associated with the Communist International or the Comintern. These institutions grew out of and were part of the global revolutionary movement inspired by the Russian October Revolution of 1917 and its supporters, such as those that took part in the German November Revolution of 1918 to 19. I was particularly intrigued by organizations that seemed to represent alliances between both movements, and that did not easily fit into the standard categories of either just the labor movement, just the agrarian movement, or just the Communist Party. A few questions that occurred to me for all of the organizations, including those that suggested alliances, were the following. Why did they form? What did they do? What difference did they make, if any, and to what? What did alliances and representation mean to them? How were they part of, or how did they take part in, the different kinds of class or other struggles of the era? So those are some of the top questions that I sought to provide answers to in this research project, and eventually book. At some point, I realized that the existing historical scholarship was almost totally useless as a means to answer these questions, because it simply did not raise these questions, simple as they are or might seem. It also did not provide much detail on any of the organizations or the broader movements that they belong to. Those might seem like very bold claims, but if you look at the introduction, you can kind of take a look and see what scholarship has said or not said about some of these issues and some of the questions that they have raised or have simply not raised. There were some old books, only in Spanish, by participants that talked about certain struggles, like big railroad strikes, the formation of huge associations to fight for land, unusual groups that tried to combine different kinds of struggles together in one, and violent, bloody, and factional conflicts and betrayals. The scholarly literature sometimes referred to these events, but barely substantiated their own claims or the accounts by participants. Scholarship also did not provide much context, guide, or narrative of the actual history of any of the struggles, or how to talk about the movements that conducted them, or sought to conduct them. When I began to search for archival sources on any of this, things got more complicated. Most of the specific organizations, including the best known, did not have accessible archives, and definitely not for the period when they began to rise after the Mexican Revolution. One thing that's really interesting is that it was almost impossible for me to find any archives of any given union or any of the agrarian leagues. It's clear that they existed, but accessing any of the individual archives for any individual union turned out to be almost impossible. I did all kinds of research, therefore, to find anything I could about any of these organizations, But even then, it was very hard to put all this together in a coherent narrative, if any existed or could be formed. This caused me a lot of confusion, to say the least. And it took me a long time to figure out how to even discuss what happened. One thing that began to become clear was that the Mexican Revolution was followed by, or might have caused, an extremely disintegrated movement and activist scene, not to mention a highly disintegrated politics. The more I could read about the politics led me to contextualize the movements in terms of numerous and global economic, state, and other types of crises. This made me want to discover how the revolution in the 1910s historically influenced the different movements in the years after it ended in the 1920s. Much scholarship on social reforms and the Constitution of 1917 suggested that the influence of the revolution on the labor movement and the agrarian movement were positive, at least for the official organizations. But then those same organizations eventually disintegrated later on during crises right before the Great Depression. My chaotic sources and fragmented narratives more and more suggested a complex, if not thoroughly negative, story of failure and defeat. This contradiction between received narratives and untold stories in the sources caused me to find ways to adjudicate these different kinds of information, and eventually convinced me to portray the history as realistically as possible. Excellent scholarship on other movements in these years, such as on the Cristeros, had already shown how some rose up and how they fared against the state, but still none gave much of a guide for my movements. That and other scholarship referred to quote unquote popular movements or social, quote unquote, social movements. And I myself often use the phrase popular social movements. But then I knew they were more than just social movements with much economic, political, and even cultural aspects. And popular seemed to me too generic sounding. It suggested a kind of popularity contest, like which was more popular than the other. So I settled on people's movements and struggles to refer to this project being about groups that sought to represent the people, quote unquote, across different classes and different movements, and not just in economic, social, political, or cultural terms. This resonated with other similar ways of talking about comparably revolutionary and inclusive things in different times and places, like people's wars, people's armies, and people's liberation. So as the subtitle suggests, this book became about people's movements and struggles in a given time and place in Mexico after the revolution. I was initially enthusiastic about how to write about movements and struggles and how they might have made a positive change in Mexico, or how their strategies, tactics, and results might have offered a different, albeit silenced way of understanding how people in the past might have conducted big nationwide cross-class conflicts. I found all of that and much more, and I remained enthusiastic about writing about this as I am now. At the same time, the events, sources, and the disintegrated or fragmentary qualities made it very hard to narrate or analyze them as if they provided a clear, coherent, or positive story. With so many and continual failures, I had difficulty finding a way to talk about success, at least in their time. So to more accurately analyze and represent what happened, I ended up taking a much more critical perspective than I might have wanted to or expected. This project became a highly critical examination of how and why people's movements and struggles in post-revolutionary Mexico failed and were so thoroughly defeated in such debilitating ways. The goal became not only to speak truth to power, but a harder work of speaking truthfully, frankly, and critically to movements themselves in a more realistic way. So some of this came out in an early argument I placed in pages 3 and 4 of the book, which you can consult if you like with the PDF that's there. And as I wrote there, this book argues that several different kinds of challenges and divisions were too powerful for any individual, group, organization, or movement to overcome. And these challenges made attempts to create lasting unity within and between movements practically impossible after the Mexican Revolution. The resulting struggles mostly resulted in failure and defeat, but it is important to understand how and why this happened and to recognize the most significant consequences. Further on, the struggles dramatize the fact that movements need strong, disciplined, and united organizations, alliances, and strategies in order to have any chance of success against more powerful companies, landlords, and the state. While it was not possible to accomplish any of these goals at the time, the explicit attempts to do so clarified the limited extent of the organized power of the people in the early years after the revolution. The struggle's failures in the 1920s helped originate the powerful national labor organizations that formed in the 1930s. Partly because the state suppressed the strongest of these organizations in the 1920s, it was able to subdue their descendants starting in the 1930s. Thereafter, the state exerted power over these organizations through its allied parties and incorporation of them as national party sectors and other means. Conflicts between independent and state allied forces within the labor and agrarian movements continued for the remainder of the century and beyond the millennium. Struggles in the 1920s nonetheless provided people's movements with valuable experiences and instilled in them a fighting spirit that lives on to this day. So these narratives, back to this presentation, turned out to be about division, defeat, failure, and ruin. Compared to the scholarship, which I thought did not even raise the questions or offer more than a bare outline of the movements or struggles, I sought to substantiate the argument that so many kinds of divisions prevented movements from fully allying, forming as one, or succeeding at their goals. The rest of the book is divided in chapters that each highlight a given struggle and or part of a movement, revealing layer upon layer of fractures and fissions across time and space throughout Mexico, and also according to global constellations in terms of various allegiances, antagonisms, and rival purposes. Part of the argument is about the importance of understanding the specific historical dynamics of movements and struggles in these years, and how and why they happened with specific concrete results. In short, I argued that it is important to understand how and why real movements and organizations conducted real struggles in history, not only to avoid mistaken assumptions about them, or to make certain kinds of overgeneralizations, to avoid those generalizations. In the case of these movements in Mexico, this can offer evidence for a more complete and accurate picture of how the relatively neglected early post-revolutionary period happened. It can also help explain why later struggles, despite appearances, resulted in increasing disempowerment of movements, and therefore harder struggles later, with even less likelihood of success than before. Even in these most supportive circumstances for movements, which included relatively favorable social, legal, and political contexts, before more overwhelming state and party control and increasingly powerful capitalism, pre-existing divisions transmitted by and through history and reproduced or worsened by movements themselves gave movements almost no possibility for success. Rather than a rosy story of success only hidden, elided, or silenced by more powerful forces, this was, in my view, a story in which the agency, consciousness, forces, and resources of people organized in movements were routed and rerouted against them, and in which they themselves played no small part in reproducing to their continual detriment. So not just given or changing historical structures, circumstances, or antagonists, but also the choices and actions of movements themselves helped spell their demise. And these consequences mattered not only in their time, but helped make later struggles difficult as well. This was the case even if, starting during the Great Depression, some of the strategies and ways of organizing helped make these movements more powerful than ever before. So what I'd like to do now is share a few summary key points, a few key takeaways from this project that I hope people can dialogue with and potentially read about if they like in the book itself. So what I'm doing now is just summarizing a little bit of what I already mentioned, but to give a more clear and direct series of points to debate. The first one has to do with understanding. Number one, the way to understand people's movements, not simply popular social movements in the years after the Mexican Revolution, is in terms of division, antagonism, alliances, and struggles within and between parts of movements and in relation to the state, companies, and landlords. Second point is certain independent parts of the labor movement and the agrarian movement were in fact, as I initially thought, as important and powerful as, if not more so, than the more well-known state-allied organizations in both movements. These were especially the strategic railroad unions and the agrarian leagues in most states, above all in Veracruz, but also throughout the nation. 3, these parts of movements grew into national forces for the first time in Mexico and did not operate only at the local or regional level. So they cannot or should not only be studied at the local or regional levels. 4, these parts of movements attempted to form deliberate nationwide alliances between movements as a whole for the first time, and did not remain within just the labor movement or just the agrarian movement. So they cannot or should not only be studied in terms of just the labor movement or just the agrarian movement. 5, they had important global and international, as well as intellectual and ideological affiliations, connections, and influences, which also means that they cannot or should not only be studied at the local, regional, or national levels. 6, many of these connections and influences were associated with communism because the Communist Party of Mexico, which itself was part of an international revolutionary movement, led most of these organizations, such as the railroad unions, the Agrarian Leagues, and the attempted allied organizations. This is yet another reason why they cannot or should not only be studied in terms of just the labor movement or just the agrarian movement, but nor can they or should they be reduced to connections to communism, since that was only one aspect, albeit important, of their activity. 7, these parts of movements mostly failed at their endeavors, including the formation of lasting national organizations and alliances, and they experienced continual defeats. This book explains how pre-existing and contemporaneous divisions, as well as consequential decisions in terms of how to conduct struggles with possible allies and antagonists, generated these outcomes. 8, the book also explains some of the longer-term results of these struggles. This included the following. Long-term divisions that were hard to overcome throughout the entire 20th century. The rise of industrial unionism. The rise of agrarian leagues at the national level. All of which were important bases of the state and its party later on. Major class conflicts, such as in the form of strikes. Those conflicts led to important legal and political changes and how the state would manage subsequent conflicts between workers and companies. And finally, the rise of attempts at national alliances between movements. Those attempts became an important aspiration and guided much organizing in that century. The last 2 points relate more specifically to the history of the time in the immediately preceding period. So, number 9, this history is about the first years after the Mexican Revolution, and attempts to add a neglected historical dimension to that period in the years 1920 to 1930 by sharing and showing how contemporaneous perspectives for movements may enrich knowledge of that period. For example, they offer different insights than those from the now better known and at the time more successful cristeros who rose in religious rebellion against the state and its seemingly revolutionary leaders. In this history, the parts of movements under differently revolutionary leadership apparently did not rebel. Instead, they disintegrated over debates on revolutionary strategy in the midst of simultaneously military and religious wars, as the state designed its own allied political party and prepared for its first national election in 1929. The final point is 10. This history may also offer retrospective insights on the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920 itself. For example, the revolution created some legal and political conditions for movements to succeed, but it also involved conflicts and reinforced divisions that made it very likely that they would fail. This suggests that the Mexican Revolution, however supportive or favorable its effects were towards movements, was ultimately deleterious for their existence and their success. So that's the main thing that I wanted to present in terms of a narrative about how I arrived at the topic, what I sought to accomplish with it, and what I thought were some of the key takeaway points with it. So now what I'd like to do is show you a little bit of the book itself, since we have technical capacity to do so, and perhaps begin to dialogue a little bit informally, and then maybe more formally in a minute, about some of what encapsulates it. So let me go ahead and share a screen really fast. and show you a little bit of it. What I'd like to do now is take a look at the image that frames this book. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit more as a group, but looking at this image, there's a lot going on. Maybe people can reflect on it for 1 second. And actually, I'd like to see if on an informal level, it'd be possible for me to kind of dialogue with you a little bit. So looking at this image, what are some kind of things that you immediately notice or that kind of stick out to you? And how do you think it might relate to this project?
I'm sure you want people to say something about Diego and Frida.
Well, they can, yeah. I mean, that's there. I mean, so yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people in the image, so it's representing a crowd, and I could talk a little bit about that. Let's see. Honestly, we know a lot more about celebrities than the other people marching. Yeah, me too. I mean, so if you look at the image, I don't know the exact names of the other people that are there. I don't know who else is there, but yeah, so there's Diego Rivera and there's Frida Kahlo. So it's a very iconic image. After I selected the image, I felt a little bit like, well, maybe I should have chosen such an iconic image, but it is one of the images that I actually write about in the book in the latter chapter. So there's a part of the story that is directly referenced there. Yeah, so you can see in the background this banner of El Sindicato de Pintores y Escultores. That's a little bit strange because, you know, the Sindicato de Pintores, the Painters Union, that was founded in late 1922, early 1923. It became the founder of the newspaper that they edited, which is El Machete. Its first issue was in March 1924. And this image was actually from May 1st, 1929. So May Day, 1929, I mean, May Day here was just a couple days ago. So if you do the math, 1929 versus 2022, this would have been the anniversary of this. And by 1929, the Sindicato de Pintores was pretty much destroyed. I mean, it didn't really operate much. El Machete still existed, but it was by then, since 1925, the newspaper of the Communist Party. So it's a little bit odd that that the Painters Union is represented there after really their heyday. Wish we could see the text on the other banners better. Who else was there? Who else was marching with them? So there's a lot of other images that show the same march. You can see some of there's different slogans about queremos algo, something about privilegiados. We can't really see what they're really saying. Patrones, explotadores. So you can sort of see some kind of images overlaid others, but you can't really see all that's there. So, you know, other images of this exact same event by some well-known photographers at the time, we'll talk about this photographer in a minute, you know, did a lot of different images like this. So one were the Casasola brothers. They did a lot of the images, of course, of the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s, but they captured a similar image here. This image was from the Italian photographer Tina Molotti. So it's actually connecting a lot of the people that were involved with the movements themselves. So some of the other things that were going on at the time, if you could look around for other banners, it's all the different organizations listed in this book. So it was a march of all these different numerous organizations that were going all over the place. Let me just give you a little flavor for some of those by turning to just the first page or so. You have this unfortunate list of acronyms and abbreviations, but it's needed because there were so many different organizations around, and it's so hard to keep track of them that it would be helpful to have a little bit of a list to go with them. But let me just show you, just on page 3, there were at least about 5 different major organizations that I write about here. And all of those were at this rally in 1929. So let me, May 1st, 1929. So let me go ahead and take the image back a little bit. So their banners were there, and you can see them in some of the other images, both by the Casasola brothers and by Tina Modotti. Let's see, let me get it back. Yeah, so of course, right in the middle is Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo. I selected this image because of its irony. Because on the one hand, you see Rivera kind of belly jutted out, kind of smiling a little bit. Frida has a much more stern glance, looking right at the camera. The image is by Tina Modotti, who actually introduced them as a couple. So I thought it would be really great to have an image of really Mexico's or even Latin America's most famous couple in a history that's outside of their artwork. But the image itself is artwork as well. So there's a visual connection based on the photography of Tina Modotti and other photographers. But at the same time, there's this activist element by some of the artists themselves. As I argue in this book, the political, revolutionary, and activist activity of the artists was usually disastrous. So putting them right in the middle of this kind of camera lens is a little bit of an irony that kind of encapsulates what's going on in the book. These different people's movements, brought artists to represent them, but they often had a role that was quite damaging. Looking at some of the messages in the chat, yeah, it clarifies why disintegration was a major theme. Not much glues these groups together. That's absolutely right. I totally agree. Yeah, and so another comment had to do with disconnections from the people that they sought to represent. That's really true as well. So there's a symbiosis between these kind of celebrity artist types and the movements that they represented. I mean, so it's sort of interesting to see how that happened. This book is not an art history, but there is art history. It can have relevance for art history because if you look at the art histories that do exist, they sometimes mention that, oh yeah, David Alfaro Siqueiros, Diego Rivera, oh, by the way, besides painting, they were also, members of some organization or leading them, but they don't necessarily say that much more. And so I try to take the opposite angle and say, well, there were these movements and organizations, and they happen to be the leaders of them, but what did they do? The other irony at play here is that May 1st, 1929 was really the pinnacle of a kind of crystallization of different organizations that tried to form alliances, but it was also the peak of really the beginning of their repression. So the actual May 1st, 1929 rally itself was repressed by state forces. And it was part of, in some ways, ignited a broader phase of repression that helped lead to the destruction of almost all of these organizations. So not necessarily much to smile about if you have Rivera there doing it. Maybe Frida had a little bit more of an idea about what was going next. But anyway, it's meant to be kind of a way to kind of make fun of the history a little bit, to kind of show how it was represented at the time, but also to show how the artists themselves were part of it, and maybe that wasn't necessarily the way to go. So let's see if there was one more comment. Yeah, so that's all I'd like to say for this presentation. And why don't we go ahead and open the floor for any comments or questions?
Thank you, Miles. There's a lot to think about there and much to discuss. Let's turn quickly to the questions. I have a couple myself, but I'll wait. Camilo, you go first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Miles.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One of them has to do with regions and periodization. So do you see this as like, as I think Romano Falcón suggested this many years ago, that there was like an early wave of Veracruz radicalism and there a later wave of Michoacán less radical movement. So in this so do you see a different or a similar pattern of like regions that at different times kind of take the lead in their social movements radicality and in their punching weight in national politics? So that's one, and the other one, I mean, I don't know if you can say something a little bit more about like the specific thing that this is adding to the literature about the Mexican left, insofar as, you know, there's a lot of so many things written about the Mexican left, like, you know, from Barry Carr to Kevin Middlebrook, some more sociological, more historical. So what's not there that's here? Yeah, but that's basically it. Thank you.
Those are great questions. Thank you so much. I really appreciate those. For the regional one, that's really great. Let me try to work with that a little bit. Yeah, Veracruz was definitely the dominant one for the agrarian side on this period. So that's been mentioned a lot. But I think what's neglected a little bit is the connection between Veracruz and some of the other regions. So, you know, in the early 1920s, the two main agrarian leagues were in Veracruz. The league was founded in 1923. The Michoacan one was actually founded a little bit earlier, 1922, with Primo Tapia and others. But I think most of the time when people talk about any of those, they only focus on Veracruz, they only focus on Michoacan, and they neglect a little bit about the broader connections or the fact that there were a lot of other similar movements going on. So by the end of this project, I ended up talking a lot more about Durango and Coahuila, and some of the different, at least on the agrarian side, what was happening regionally in those places that then connected to some of these national events. So the organizers in Veracruz, Usulo Galvan and others, were definitely the dominant figures in the agrarian movement, both at the regional level in Veracruz and then nationally after 1926, with the founding of the Liga Nacional Campesina. But there were other players. So in this case, you know, a purely regional history, Michoacan, Veracruz, or even Coahuila would kind of miss some of the kind of national waves that were occurring. You know, where there was an attempt, at least, to try to connect some of the different regional leagues together into one national version. Of course, it was a failure, or not of course, but I showed that there's a failure in that case. But it was something that I think it's hard to get at only by purely local or regional studies. In terms of the other questions, a really great question. What does this have that some of those other ones do not? Some of the exact texts that you mentioned were ones that really inspired me early on to learn a lot more about this. So for example, you know, Kevin Middlebrook's book, you know, he dedicates about a page or two to some of these events in the 1920s or 1930s and sort of mentions how they were really important for the rise of the industrial unions later on. But it was just very tantalizing, and I just want to know more. Like, well, what about, you know, is there something more we can say about, you know, the railroad unions, for example, or these big national associations that were different than the ones that were well known. Same thing with Carr's work. I mean, there's one short chapter that deals with the 1920s in his book, and you know, for the late 1920s in particular, there's almost nothing mentioned. I mean, it's just very, very brief, very schematic. And this, compared to all of the works that we're mentioning, this has just a much more detailed focus and narrative than all of those. So thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, I have one. I might as well put it in. So I guess I'm curious. So these are radical popular movements of various kinds through the 20s. You say it's a story of failure, of disintegration, of division, and so on. So why do you think, I mean, I guess there's two parts to the question. Why do you think it's nevertheless important? I mean, I suppose that some of those other people who you were just mentioning might say, well, I didn't say much about them in my book because it didn't amount to much. So I, you know, a couple of footnotes and on you go. They try to do something. Now, obviously, you spent the whole book on them. You think they're important. Why is that? And a related question is, I mean, it's difficult, I know, to answer this in general, but maybe you can take a shot. why, I mean, how would you explain those failures? I mean, at the end here, when you were talking about the 20s and the late 20s and so on, I mean, so is the explanation repression, you know, that more radical movements were repressed out of existence or into compliance? Or, I mean, you also have this whole discussion about division, disagreement, you know, I mean, where does one place the emphasis here on the story? So I guess, why does it matter even if they failed, and why did they fail?
Yeah, really great questions. It'll take me a really long time to try to answer them, but I'll try to give a few, as you say, shots. In terms of why other scholars didn't deal with these, I'm not sure. I mean, the main thing that I can kind of hypothesize is that it just wasn't their subject. So, you know, if they're focusing on the state, they didn't necessarily matter much to the state. If they focused on one of the parties, it didn't. What's happening here didn't really matter much to those individual political parties. So, you know, but if you look at the broader movements, like just the labor movement or just the agrarian movement, all of what happened really mattered a lot to how those movements turned out. So, you know, if you look at the kind of large, well-known official organizations, there's much more written on those, but they neglect the other ones. Even though even the large, well-known ones failed as well. So it becomes, for me, a little bit of a story about, well, you know, how do you talk about the organizations that that in some ways challenged these other more well-known versions, and what happened with them? Of course, for the different types of studies that gave them only footnotes, it just wasn't part of the main focus. But if the focus was focusing squarely on, you know, movements and what they tried to do, it would have to be a much more intense study. That we can only know that just by doing the study itself. Let's see. Another way to answer that has to do with. Let me try to work with your next question about you know, the exact logic and how this turned out. And this goes back to the first question from the previous audience member about the timing of it. This all came to a head and to a peak in 1929. So in 1927 and 1929, there was a series of ways these different organizations started to coalesce, but there was all these different crises that were happening with the state and within Mexico as a whole. So it's a period of crisis of both development and destruction, and repression is definitely one feature of it. But these movements, you know, were not the main threat to the state. The main threats to the state were the Cristeros, and then later the military rebels of early 1929. So the state was more or less neglectful of the organizations that I'm looking at. But once they defeated the Cristeros, or once they made peace with the Cristeros, and once they defeated the military rebels, they really focused on other opposition threats. And so that's where there became more of a wave of repression by the state against these specific organizations. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, it's what I try to portray is that there's much more going on at the level of leaders, members, organizations, and movements themselves playing a role in that. So it's not just something that's an external force that put them out of commission. It was their own choices about how they would form alliances with each other. So, for example, alliances, you know, chosen by the leagues, the Agrarian League leaders, in opposition to the prior alliances that they had set up in 1929, is really what kind of demolished these other organizations and these attempted alliances. So a lot more to say, but those are my brief attempts to answer these really excellent questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Benjamin, you're next.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. I had somewhat similar questions to the previous ones. I wonder if you could speak a bit more to analytically how you were thinking about the question of movement co-optation or corporatism, because quickly looking at the text, you do seem to talk about the ways that movements were neutralized or sort of taken over by the state. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that, given that I haven't looked at the text. And I'll say one last thing. I'm thinking very specifically about, for instance, the Railroad Workers Union. You know, there's a historiography that talks about the slightly later period after your book that says that it was actually the autonomy and the militancy and the willingness to strike at a national level within this industrial union in the 20s and the 30s that pressured the state to nationalize the industry under Cárdenas. So I wonder how sort of those kinds of things square with your analytical framework, and if the question of compromise then between state and popular movements becomes sort of a more complicated or thorny question.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a huge question as well. Let me try to work with it a little bit. In terms of co-optation and corporatism, those sound a little bit more like the period that's after the period I deal with. In other words, more of the 1930s. So what I try to show here is how there were earlier lineages of something like that already happening in the late 1920s, even though it's not as visible as in the 1930s. So for example, the National Revolutionary Party, PNR, that was founded in 1929, of course, but it did not have this sectoral structure that the Cardenista, PRM had when it was founded in 1938. So the real full-scale corporatism and absorption of these large organizations or later large organizations into the political party itself, that was only once there was a state-allied party in existence for about 11 years from 1929 to 1938. So, in terms of the corporatism of, or these kind of huge sectoral structure of the political party under Cárdenas, that's later on. But what I try to show in this book is that there was a little bit of an origin of that here, in the sense that the state had these alliances with organizations like the CRON, in the labor movement, and others in the agrarian movement. And there was a little bit of a kind of a co-optation happening there at the top level in the 1920s, but before there was a state-allied party. The idea about co-optation basically did not continue in that way into the late 1920s and early 1930s, and it was sort of brought back under Cárdenas with the founding of the Revolutionary Party of Mexican Revolution in 1938. What I try to argue here is that the failures of the struggles of the 1920s facilitated this later co-optation and the later absorption of these larger organizations later on in the 1930s, which would take a different research to fully substantiate that, but there's a little bit of an origin there for this. In terms of the thing about different sort of strikes and struggles, one thing I noticed early on is that starting in this period, there were about every decade, there was a huge national railroad strike. 1927, the one that I look at, I have a whole chapter on that in this book, chapter 3, is one of the first big versions of that. There was definitely a big one in 1921 that was more of a success. 1927 was more of a failure, but it evoked different, caused different changes that became patterns that were more closely followed later on by the unions. So for example, there wasn't a national railroad union until 1933, and the 1927 railroad strike in some ways gave rise to the need to form a more coherent national union. Once that existed from 1933, there was big strikes thereafter, pretty much every decade. And definitely the railroad strike of 1936 definitely helped cement national industrial unionism in Mexico as such, and did provide a kind of a support or a kind of rationale for the nationalization of both the railroad industry in 1937, if not also, we would have to do research on this, if not also the old nationalization of 1938, because the railroad union itself was instrumental in organizing both the mining and the oil unions. So if the oil union helped pressure the state to nationalize in 1938, it was in no small part to the railroad union that had already existed before, which then links backwards to the time that I write about, which is when those types of events were just germinating more than having the results that they would have later.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, while people come up with them, I do then have another one. I mean, we know what happened, and so when looking back at things like this, it's easy to sort of have or develop a certain kind of idea or air of inevitability about some of these historical developments. So I wanted to know, I mean, if you take any of the groups you want, the Ligas Agrarias, any, the Railroad Union, pick maybe the strongest case or the one you like the best. Could you imagine, sort of from the vantage point of the 1920s, a different outcome? I mean, I know it's a counterfactual question, but it's just maybe sometimes fun to think with, given what they were organizing for, given what they were trying to do, were different outcomes ever really, in your view, viable, regardless of what did happen?
That's a great question. Yeah, I love that kind of question. Yeah, I mean, I think I began from the standpoint of, nothing's inevitable. It's all contingent. Things could go in any kind of different way. And then in writing this, it seemed to be like more and more the case that there was not a lot of way around what actually happened. So, at least from the perspective of once these organizations solidified by the late 1920s, once they started forming these different alliances with each other, it started to become a question of, well, what would happen next? So what would be inevitable or what would be more contingent? Would it be inevitable, more or less, that the state would then start to kind of attack them or try to dismantle them? Possibly. I mean, there's a lot of contingent features, though. So, for example, on the state side. So, for example, if Obregón had not been assassinated in 1928, would this have looked differently? Well, absolutely. I mean, things might have looked very differently if Obregón had stayed in power and had not been assassinated. So it starts yielding an infinite array of other counterfactuals, like, well, the only reason why Plutarco Elías Calles and others decided that they were going to create a national state party was as an immediate response to Obregón's assassination in 1928. So, if Obregón had not been assassinated, well, then they would not have had a political party to really represent themselves in a way that would want to exclude or oppose other groups that were out there. Another counterfactual that would arise that would matter a lot to this is in terms of the inevitability of what would have happened. Well, what if the Cristeros had truced just a year earlier or 2 years earlier, or if the Cristiada had kept going on for much longer, so that La Segunda would not have been a Segunda, it just would have been a continual one. If the Cristero rebellion had stopped a lot earlier, or if it had never happened, this definitely would have looked totally different. I mean, these organizations I look at might have had a different chance, or they might have had a worsened capacity because the state might have been more interested in dealing with them versus the focus that they did have when dealing with was more of the military threat by the Cristeros. So there's a lot of moving parts in terms of other possibilities that might have occurred otherwise. Given everything more or less remaining the same, I don't know how much room there could have been. A lot of the choices, the contingent part has to do with some of the consciousness choices and seeming agency of some of the leaders of these organizations. For example, if none of the leadership of any of these organizations had decided to leave their alliances or to form a connection with the state during the time when this military rebellion was breaking out, things might have been been able to kind of last into the 1930s in a stronger sense. But since the military rebellion did occur, since the Cristero rebellion was still happening, since Obregón had been assassinated, and since the state thought it needed to found a national party, that ended up being off the table. So it was sort of looking for ways to kind of disrupt some of the organizing that had been occurring kind of under the cover. So yeah, I guess my answer is that any of the counterfactuals start raising a lot of other counterfactuals about a lot of other things that if they had been slightly different than would these have had a better chance? They might have. I mean, if the state had not gone on to a repressive element to them, if Cardenas had been elected in 1929 rather than 1934, then this might have looked very different. You might have seen some of the things in the 30s happening a lot earlier. But yeah, that's all I can say for now on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, we're almost out of time. I guess we'll use the minute or so we have left, especially if any of you or some of you who arrived a little later. Miles's book is available through open access for download. So it's a wonderful opportunity for people to get a digital copy of it. I think the link is here on the chat, but for those of you who may be watching this later, when we post the video, you can go to the website of Oxford University Press, or you could also go to Miles Rodriguez's webpage at Bard College and find the connection there to a digital copy of the book. I do encourage people to get it and to read it. There will be much there to think about. And with that, all that's left is to thank Professor Miles Rodriguez for sharing his new work with us, and thank all of you for having joined us this afternoon. Be well and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
And we can stop recording.